Okay, welcome to the Disallowed Cost seminar hosted by the NEC. We've had some complaints about the music already, so apologies for that. It's hosted here at the Institution of Civil Engineers in London. I'm Stuart Kings, NEC consultant, and the overall objectives of the webinar are to explore the concept of disallowed cost. We've got just under 500 people that have logged on, so it's obviously an interesting subject for the construction industry. We're also going to look at some of the key defined terms that are relevant to disallowed cost, defined cost, disallowed cost, and fee, and also promote the concept of a commercial management plan we'll come on to towards the end of the session. Very importantly, we're going to look at some questions from users, and we've had plenty of those already. I'm Stuart Kings, hosting today's event, and recently delivered the Project Manager Accreditation Programme.
I'm Matthew Garratt. I'm here to represent the contractor's point of view with regard to disallowed cost.
Very importantly.
And I'm Barry Trebes, here to represent the employee's interests in disallowed costs.
So hopefully we've got a balanced panel, and we've got lots of questions to go through later on. In terms of structure, we intend to go through, first of all, a bit of an introduction to the NEC user group and promote what we do. We'll then look at the relevant terms and defined terms within the contract. This concept of a commercial management plan, because from our perspective, many of the problems emanate from not having a proper plan in place from the outset of particularly option C contracts. And then we'll get on to the questions that you posed prior to logging in today. Just a little bit about the NEC user group. The ECC, the Engineering and Construction Contract, is one of 12 within the NEC suite, the most popular in practice. I'm sure users are familiar with the fact that the contract is used internationally and ever growing. We've got user groups in the UK, Asia Pacific, and Australasia. We've got frequent seminars, webinars, NEC user group internationally, and also newsletters. So today is part of a number of different media to engage with members and ensure that we get best practice out there in practice on our projects. Today's focus is on the engineering and construction contract. From our experience, options A and C are very popular in practice. Obviously, the concept of disallowed cost is relevant for options C, D, E, and F in particular. And a lot of the questions that we've had from people that have logged on relate just specifically to option C. We've had a lot of feedback from users, and through research, we recognise that there could be greater clarity on interpretation of things like defined cost, disallowed cost, and fee. And the webinars, as I say, is part of that ongoing process to promote that to users.
So, in terms of the contractor's point of view, I think one of the main issues we see with disallowed cost in principle is the tendency, maybe even human nature, for in circumstances when anything goes wrong or mistakes are made prior to completion, there is a tendency for people to reach for the disallowed cost clause. Now, from a contractor's point of view, we're very clear that not everything that happens that goes wrong prior to completion is a disallowed cost. If we were working under a lump sum contract, of course, we'd be allowed to price and be paid a risk contingency that will cover us for the normal run rate of things that don't quite go well first time. Under a cost reimbursable contract, option C, D, E, and F, we're only reimbursed our proven defined cost, and therefore there is no such contingency payable to the contractor for their general mistakes and things that need to be tested and commissioned before they're put right. So it's A, unfair, and B, the rules of the NEC contract don't provide that anything that goes wrong, i.e. defects or rectifying defects prior to completion, is generally not a disallowed cost.
So fair point on that, because I think a lot of employers get upset that they're paying for defects prior to completion. Your point, Matthew, is that under option A, you pay for that anyway. I suppose under option C, the employer benefits from buying gains and better procurement of subcontractors. So it's a balanced approach, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the remedy for inefficient delivery prior to completion is in the pay and gain mechanism associated with the target.
Okay, perhaps if we look at some of the defined terms first of all, because before we get into the questions, it's important to understand some of the key defined terms. So in terms of disallowed cost, what is disallowed cost? I'm sure that many people have logged on or are familiar with these, perhaps through debate and discussion on your live projects. But there is a definition of disallowed cost. Probably aware that under options C, D, and E, this is clause 11.2 in brackets 25. Then under option F, it's 11.226. I suppose the logic within the ECC for disallowed cost is that it, first of all, motivates the contractor to work efficiently. I suppose the flip side is it protects the employer from poor management or having to pay for poor management or excessive waste or not following specific procedures that the employers put in the works information or procurement procedures. So that's the overall logic of disallowed cost. From your point of view, Barry, what kind of problems do you see in practice with disallowed cost?
Well, I think the thing with cost-based contracts is that the prime concern to the employer is the fact, should he be paying for everything? So, a phrase that we use sometimes here is about projects being treated as hospital jobs, so it's flooded with resources, flooded with people, flooded with equipment that's not being used to provide the work. So, that's a chief concern to the employer, that we're only paying for things that we should be paying for. And there is a concern there's a lack of incentive, maybe on a cost-based contract for the contractor to do that. So disallowed cost is one of the mechanisms in the contract for trying to, as you say, safeguard against excessive wastage, poor management. But I think essentially as well, I think employers need to appreciate by choosing a cost-based contract that essentially it is going to be a shared risk contract. And by the very nature of that, that means probably that, we've got a target, the target's can probably be the contractor's best guess. At that point, you may well not have had maybe little design work that's been fully completed. In terms of subcontractors probably won't be fully let. So there's lots of decisions to be made. You're tending to go down cost-based contracts because maybe there are some risks that go with that particular project. So all in all, the message really is there that the employer needs to play his role with the contractor right from day one, because there are lots of decisions and other things to be made. And I think as well, getting clarity about what is disallowed cost, because one of the issues is that disallowed cost gets banded around on projects, like Matthew was saying, and it gets abused and misused when there's a very precise terminology to go with disallowed costs, coupled with other ways of looking at costs under the contract.
What we've got on the screen there is an abridged version of the definition of disallowed cost within the contract. And these are costs that we recognise as an employer that the contractor incurred. But under the specific definition, we're saying we're not paying for them. That's probably a way of summarising what is disallowed cost. But I think in practice, Matthew, you probably hear we're not paying you for something and therefore it's disallowed. But disallowed cost is a specific definition within the contract.
Yeah, it certainly is, Stuart. Of course, the definition of what the contractor can be paid is under defined cost. And the defined cost defines, if you like, it filters out the admissible costs from the inadmissible costs.
Yeah.
Not all inadmissible costs should be described as disallowed costs. You might describe them as fee-based costs. But an admissible cost under the definition of defined cost, the schedule of cost components, could become disallowed in certain circumstances described under the definition of disallowed cost.
Yeah. So disallowed cost is a specific definition. Things that we just don't pay the contractor for are not necessarily disallowed. So disallowed cost is a specific definition. Yeah. So if we have a look at the kind of interplay of perhaps three main concepts, we've got specifically under option C, we focus on that, because that's where most of the questions have come from. We've got a definition of defined cost, which is divided into subcontractors, which is relatively straightforward, it says, although maybe not so. Subcontractors, and then for other costs, which is largely the contractor, we've got the schedule cost components. So if something's not in defined cost, then if we look at clause 52.1, it says it must be in the fee, or it's treated as being in the fee. We've also got rates and percentages in contract data part 2 that the tenderer has priced as part of that tender. Things like working areas overhead, those kind of items, design overhead, manufacturing fabrication. And then we've also got a bucket, I suppose, as fee, which is typically the contractor's overhead, profit, and basically anything that they can't get reimbursed for under any defined cost or a rate or percentage within contract rate for Part 2. So perhaps if you look at something like insurance, that would be included within the fee. It's not disallowed, it's not under the disallowed cost definition, it's something within the fee. So I think probably people that have logged on appreciate this already, that understanding those definitions and how they interplay is absolutely key within this debate of disallowed cost.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, Stuart, and say you might think that the rules and the lists of things that are admissible as costs are quite complicated and quite detailed, but I don't think there's any form of cost reimbursable contract that can be operated without such a list that protects the employer and the contractor. We're being very, very precise about what is included in the fee and which costs will be reimbursed.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Matthew. I think the thing is that the schedule of cost components is a very good starting mechanism, but I think where you get into long-term relationship with frameworks, etc., it may well be that you want to develop more clarity about some of the components within the schedule of cost components, just to take away that debate and discussion after the contract is let. So I think certainly, having clarity in what's included within the components can be a very good step before you let the contract, just to make sure it's very clear about what costs are going to be form part of the client costs, what are going to form part of the fee percent, just to clarify those areas if you're unsure. And I think it's important for the employer to understand what are you going to pay for and understand those situations. So I think it's a little bit of preparation before you go into the contract.
Yeah, and I think the contract is by and large very successful at eliminating most of the ambiguity. But there's always circumstances that would throw up situations that you look at the drafting and you think, I'm not quite clear about this. Yeah. And that would be the case in any set of rules under any contract.
One of the key concepts we want to get across within the webinar, and is confirmed by people that have logged on, is don't leave it late in understanding this as a team. Nothing more damaging than going into the contractor accounts at the end of the project, particularly if it's high value. Perhaps values are relevant, it's just the concept of going in late is very damaging to a relationship and commercially. So what we would promote is a commercial management plan early in the project, and hopefully through the webinar and guidance that the NC have published, the definition of cost and what we don't pay for is pretty clear. Very important for the team to go on that journey and not make sweeping adjustments to the account further downstream. So that's absolutely key.
Yeah, I'd like to add in, I think it's really important for both sides, the employer and the contractors, to understand that we need to be managing disallowed cost right from the outset of the contract. And as you see, in the monthly assessments, there is this idea that the project manager is assessing, deciding what is disallowed cost. And that should be done. So there are definitely issues about timing, and this needs to be something that's an ongoing process. Nothing worse than leaving things for several months or maybe a number of years in a project and then suddenly saying to Matthew, you're actually going to give me £10 million back because he thinks he's banked the money. So the whole timing issue, I guess you've got a few views on that, Matthew, in terms of the timing of disallowed cost.
Yeah, obviously it's a nasty shock for a contractor to find that there is a view from the employer or the project manager that a large swathe of his costs are being disallowed or late in the contract. So I think the NEC philosophy is to agree most things progressively and prospectively as opposed to wait until the end. There isn't a specific requirement under the engineering and construction contract to do that, and I think it would be one of the key features of a commercial plan to ensure that there is some form of progressive agreement on the treatment of defined costs, and specifically levels to anything that would be disallowed.
And I think the issue about the timing is the fact that you can have a very good relationship on a project until you get some disallowable costs, or just this. And I think just really emphasising the whole issue about phraseology and the terminology that's used can actually become very emotive and disrupt the behaviours on a project. So I think it's very important to have the right terminology in place. And as Matthew said, it's absolutely essential to make sure that you've got an audit plan in place that's going through progressively, so you can deal with things as issues that go right through. But I think also it's also before the contract is let that you've got clarity about what isn't going to be paid for both the employer and for the contracting side. So to me, I think the contract should be given an opportunity if there are certain things you're not prepared to pay for in the schedule of cost price, making it very clear so that pre-contract, the contract has the opportunity to include that risk as part of its fee percentage.
Yeah, no, that sounds good, Barry. But from a contractor's point of view, if we're going to have some clarity on the application of disallowed cost, or in fact the process of audit and agreement, it would be very useful for a contractor to have that at the time of tender, so that we can actually price the cost or the benefit of that process into the target or into the contract sum.
It sounds like it would be a good idea for the AET to publish some guidance on how to create a commercial management plan. Is that correct? Would that be a good idea, Barry, do you think?
I think certainly from an employer's point of view, I think it's good to have a commercial management plan. I think from an employer's perspective, I think sometimes people, in maybe the professional services contract for the project manager, for instance, they say, well, manage the NEC3 contract in accordance with the terms and conditions. But actually, I think a little bit more visibility about what is required in the commercial management plan would be a very good thing. And that's a very useful checklist, because obviously a lot of organisations will have their own project management procedures and plans, and that can then be supplemented into commercial management. So I think it would be very useful to do that. And I think also from an employer's point of view, you have the comfort to know that that is something very specific that you're looking for the project manager to do when he's managing those contracts. Because again, one of the risks is that, as an employer, putting in the hands of the project manager the management of the contract, and there are a number of features in the contract that are not always that visible in terms of providing the employer some comfort, some control over, admissible costs, non-admissible costs, and other things, other sums to be paid or retained. These are sometimes missed, so I think it's very important.
Good governance.
Yeah, it's good governance.
And as if by coincidence, one we've made earlier, or not quite, we intend to publish a commercial management plan guide at the next user conference in the UK in April of this year. Being reviewed currently, and hopefully that will give greater guidance to users internationally about how to create a commercial management plan. But it's about dealing with it early, isn't it? That's the key concept really that we want to get across.
Yeah. And I think there was, just adding to that as well, I think some research, it's quite a few years old now, but there was a Syria report number 1885, which I think was published in 1982 by Professor Perry and Thompson, which is a very in-depth study of cost-based contracts. And one of the things that did come out of that was this idea of having a joint planning and financial team with the contractor on cost-based contracts to try and how can you realise that, to me, it's about how can you realise the benefits of a cost-based contract. And it's about that joint planning and decision-making, financial management that's important.
Apologies for the noise outside, that's London on a Friday afternoon for you. But we've got over 600 people logged on. The good news is the numbers haven't gone down. So that's quite a way if the numbers went down, isn't it? We've got loads of questions coming up. So just to recap, one of the key concepts we wanted to get across was the need for a commercial management plan, for that to be in place early. So professional commercial management of ECC contracts. We just touched on, and we're not going through in detail, but clause 52.1 is a very important clause within the contract. There's lots of facets within that clause. Defined cost is key, and also disallowed cost, which is the topic of the seminar, is a certain set of parameters that we don't pay for. So we recognise the contractors incur the cost. Under certain sets of circumstances, we don't pay those particular costs. Again, the logic is it motivates the contractor to be efficient in the way they work and to protect the employer against poor project management, excessive waste, and not following specific procedures. So at that point, enough from us, I think. Would it be nice if we just pick up on 2.1? Sure.
Just before we move on to the questions, I think it's quite useful to look at that because there are a couple of features in clause 52.1 which are about competitively tendered rates and prices. So again, from an employer's perspective, that's a little bit of protection, I guess. Maybe the contractor going to his own in-house subcontractors, that you've got to demonstrate that.
And again, market as well.
Open market. Yeah. And again, a situation where the EC takes you too far, but you've got requirements, further requirements about subcontracting, maybe pre-competitive price, for instance, for subcontracts. And that's something that you need to be putting into the works information. And the other side of it is also about discounts, because that can be an emotive and difficult area. I'm sure again Matthew's got a few views and issues about discounts that can be recovered from the contractor.
Yeah, and I think the contract's very clear that all such discounts, rebates and reductions in costs need to be brought into the contract and declared and considered when calculating defined cost. Yeah. I don't think there's any grey area there.
Things like intercompany transfers are always a hot potato, aren't they? And if we as a contractor have got a plant hire company and we charge those rates to the contract, we can't just charge what the intercompany charges us. We have to prove that that is competitive in open market, but that's often an area of contention. And when it does become a little bit difficult with discounts and rebates, is not just those that are project specific, but perhaps volume discounts that are perhaps done year end at headquarters of the main contractor. But in theory, they should all come back to a particular project. Okay, so if we look at some of the questions that are coming in thick and fast, and I'll enjoy this because it can test your knowledge of the contract. So one of the specific questions, and they're often really, really narrow, the question, but they'll be a source of debate on the particular project. We've got one that's just come up. Mobile phone cost charges. Do we pay for that or not? Is that a direct cost or not?
Well, I think that's quite an interesting one, because actually it's an administrative cost, but it would be, to me, part of the working area overhead percentage.
Yeah.
So that's what it would be found, rather than a specific cost in the same right, it would be in the working area overhead percentage.
And on this occasion, the employer and the contractor would tend to agree.
We'll have to break you two up if you disagree.
There's plenty of chance for that.
So I think key concept for the estimator, which we don't often see on NEC training courses, maybe we should see more of them, but from an estimator's perspective, if we can't be reimbursed on the defined cost, it may be part of a contract later part 2 rate or percentage, which is the mobile phone cost, isn't it? That's within the working hours area. And if it's not in there, it's in the fee. So making sure that we've got the money in the correct bucket or area is absolutely vital.
It's extremely vital, Stuart, in terms of fully understanding the schedule of cost components and the percentages that the schedule of cost components refers to as being representative of certain cost factors and will be used. Understanding what is needed to be priced within the fee is a very important part of estimating, and I think it's an area where contractors, and even more so when you go down the supply chain, subcontractors bidding on NEC contracts and completing contract data to make sure that it represents their needed recoveries is a real area there where there is an expertise needed, and it's not straightforward as per your estimating process for any other project.
And I think that's really important as well, because I think that what we're also talking about, if you have that greater clarity before you actually start to run the project, then actually, because it's a shared risk contract, contractors, the employers paying defined cost, we can actually ensure that the contractor and the employers team can actually work more efficiently and effectively in managing the contract. Because the more we argue, these are all costs that have been attracted that aren't adding any value to the project. So up front, which is really valuable to help us the smooth running of the contract, post-contract. So anything we can do on that front is really useful.
One of the questions that just come up, I've lost it from the screen, so we've got some new questions coming in, but on a contract, we've got quarterly reviews of cost. Is that fair? Any views on that? So the open report being quarterly, the money is deducted on a quarterly basis.
Well, the obvious answer, Stuart, is that's much better than leaving it till the end.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, ideally, you might want to do it monthly or weekly, but quarterly is a step in the right direction. I think it's a good practice.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think that's important. I'd agree with that from the first point of view. And I think, I think Matthew hit the nail on the head about it being a progressive audit. And it may well be, if you look at a contract, you can apply the 80-20 rule and look at 20% of the items which are 80% of the cost. It doesn't need to be everything, but you can now certainly have a rolling program of reviewing costs as you go through. And I think as well as that, there is perhaps an opportunity when you look at contracts, especially cost-based contracts, that probably maybe, 3/4 of the way through, it's worthwhile doing a real sanity check on where you absolutely are under the project. And maybe you should do it more regularly now, but I think there's definitely that idea that you're trying to get to a point of just having a bit of navel grazing to see exactly where you are at that point as you're trying to close the contract out.
Yeah, perhaps an obvious comment, but absolutely key right at the beginning of the contract that the employer and contractor team get around the room, make sure they've got a really clear definition of cost and set procedures up correctly right from day one. If that carries forward for 6 months and then we've got disagreements on what should be paid and what shouldn't be, that's going to be very damaging for either party really. So it's all in the setup, I think.
Yeah. And I think the other interesting thing to me, I think, as well, with from the employer side is, I think it's very useful to kind of look at what I call a money map to see where the money is in the contract. Because sometimes you'll find that maybe you've got a contractor who's really performing a management role, so maybe the schedule of cost components is relevant for maybe 10 or 15 or 20% of the overall cost of the contract. And I think an area that to me that's kind of neglected is in terms of the management of subcontractors. And again, that can be an area that can be very emotive and difficult. And sometimes, where contractors, well-meaning, go off and do horse deals with their subcontractors. What's the employer's team supposed to do with that? Maybe he hasn't followed the subcontract procedures, etc. So that can lead to some issues as well. So, the management of subcontracts overall as well as part of the overall management of costs is very important.
Yeah, you're right, Barry. The area of subcontracting and administering subcontracts with particular reference to change and compensation rates. It's really important for the contractor to keep a really good audit trail, subcontractor account payments and compensation event agreements. One of the definitions of disallowed cost is amounts that have been paid to a subcontractor which should not have been under their contract. So, as you rightly say, sort of undefined or unexplained amounts agreed for compensation events leaves the contractor in a position where he may not be easily able to explain or justify the reasons for those payments, and he could be exposed to disallowed costs. So I think it's an area for a huge amount of attention for contractors to make sure that the audit trail around subcontract payments and account agreements is really clear.
And I think also, just to add to that, I think it was 20.4, which is about the contractor effectively advising the project manager about subcontracting arrangements, is a very, very important function from the employer's point of view, because what's it saying? We need to sit down and discuss these things. And sometimes maybe a horse deal that the contractors do might actually be good for the project, but the thing is that the contractor needs to keep the project manager and ultimately the employer informed of what the company are doing and carry along the employer and the project manager along with those discussions, so you don't have that situation where these problems arise.
We're halfway through, it's got half an hour left, that's gone quick, isn't it? One of the questions that's coming up repeatedly is black holes in pensions. Do we pay for almost like a back payment for black holes in pensions? So,
okay, it's a really good question, Stuart, because many big organisations have got pension funds with a funding deficit, and it is a real cost of business to put some money into those funds to correct that imbalance. And many companies will view that as a cost of employing people and as part of the overall cost of running a pension scheme. So we do see those costs appearing as part of pension costs associated with people, and it's not an uncommon audit query, Stuart. It would be a really good idea to address that in the commercial management plan, I think. Another way of really being clear about this is to ensure that there's clarity on how this is treated in perhaps the build-up to the target, and to declare, where that money sits and how it's going to be treated in terms of recognising it's the prime cost or whether it's going to be within the fee.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, I think this is something that comes up, that's come up quite regularly, and I think, from an employer's perspective, when you look at the schedule of cost components in item 11, which is about wages and salaries, amounts paid by the contract people paid according to the time worked while they're within working areas, that would infer me to believe that should be in the fee. But I think, you know, an obvious way to clarify that is in clarifying the schedule of cost components, as you say, and actually making it very clear, and giving the contract the opportunity to say it's very clear that that particular issue you are deemed to include that in the fee, so you're allowed to take account of that in the fee percentage, rather than having that debate and discussion which is going on. But from the I think from the employer's perspective, to me, it kind of fits. You know, it shouldn't fit a deficit, shouldn't fit within, you know, core component one of the particular cost component.
Yeah. Many people clarify this for example, but from an NEC perspective, we'd say it's pretty clear anyway. According to the time that they're within the working area, so it's only the pension attributable while we're within the working area.
Yeah, I think, you know, NEC obviously promotes an approach of mutual trust and cooperation, and I think if the contractor's being clear where that cost sits, if it does, within their build up to their prices, you ought to be able to resolve it on that basis.
Absolutely.
And I think this is a good point as well. I think, you know, when you are in the pre-contract stage, if there is uncertainty, then this is where, you know, these type of things should be flagged up during the tendering process, and they can be, you know, obviously then the employer can decide how he would like those things to be treated if he hasn't gone to the extent of rewriting the schedule of cost components in more detail. But I think, to me, inherently, again, it's about efficient working, and if you can clarify those type of things, then obviously when you get post-contract, you know, you're not going to waste hours arguing about which basically both sides are incurring costs for that. So it would be better to clarify that.
Sure, and I would say it's a very good question for the employer to ask when evaluating tenders from contractors or comparing fee percentages. What is in those fee percentages?
Yeah. Okay, another question that's come up a number of times is, although a small cost, but the cost of things like tea and coffee and biscuits and sandwiches, it seems to have come up a number of times and been a real area of debate on some projects.
Yeah. Well, it's not a problem in this seminar, Stuart, is it? There's no tea or coffee.
We've got lots of water.
Yeah.
But in terms of the project, I think this is working areas, overhead, everything. Myself and the employer agree with what's against it. So,
yeah. No disagreement there whatsoever.
No.
I mean, I think in practice, I don't know if you agree, Matthew, from a contractor's point of view, understanding the ECC in detail is one task in its own right, isn't it? The estimator knowing what you're going to get paid for in the final cost, what should be in the contract data part 2, rate of percentage, and what's in fee. But of course, in practice, we've often got heavy amendments, which makes it ever more difficult.
Makes it extremely difficult, Stuart. And if there's any employer or contractor embarking for the first time or the first time with a group of people on an NEC contract, there's 2 bits of advice that will be given. One, you're going to need to do some training before you even start to respond to a inquiry to tender. And the second thing is you're going to need to know that there will be a certain amount of resource level to do the upfront preventative actions needed to make the job a success that NEC requires, but it doesn't just suggest. Of course, I've also suggested in the past that training should be done project specific, so that if there are particular seg clauses or if there is a specific commercial plan on a particular project, the employer, the contractor, maybe the designers, the supervisor can do the training together, talk about not just what the contract says, but how they're going to implement it. That could be a really good time to actually draw up the bones of the commercial plan in those upfront sessions where we're being jointly trained and jointly refreshed on the requirements of the NEC contract.
So I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that as well. And I think this is part of it is, you know, the contract, but part of it is phrase I would use about the working practices. You know, it's very clear, for instance, like clause 3 about the programme, but actually what you're going to do every day, what you're going to do every week, what you're going to do every month to make that work, which is something you pick. So you can either play ping pong, or you're actually going to work together, understand the processes of how you're going to work together to get those. So I wholeheartedly agree with that.
Just looking at one of the questions here, we've got, can we be reimbursed for a visiting planner program, visiting the site to update his program?
Well, I think so, Stuart. I think if they're in the working areas and they're providing the works, they are part of defined cost. And my question will always be, if he's not involved providing the works, then what is he doing on my time?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think this is again, one of the other little aspects of NEC is about the working area concept. About that's another form of for the employer about having control and why we have the working area concept in terms of being the site and other areas where the contractor may be working, is that gives then the employer some visibility of what the areas where the contractor may be incurring costs, and enable the employers to make sure they're keeping records and understand what the contractor is doing. So that's another way of making sure that we've got some control. So there are lots of little control mechanisms in the ECC contract that I think are not always connected up together and not always used as they could be.
Yeah. The working areas are key, aren't they? Because you've incurred costs of the contractor and you've not declared an area as a working area. You can't do it retrospectively. It needs to be agreed up front. And it must pass the two definitions within the contract. So the working areas are absolutely vital. Okay, we've got, maybe this is a sore point in this particular project, but a bonus payment to the quantity surveyor on a previous project has come through on the cost on the project. Is that payable or not? Is that part of the contract?
I'll let the employer decide that.
Maybe I would think, costs that are incurred in relation to the specific project.
Yeah.
Does it fall within that? Does it fall within that definition?
I mean, I would tend to think that it needs to be a payment in respect of the project. As it says here, wages, salaries, and amounts paid by the contractor for people paid according to the time worked while they are within the working areas. It just seems to me that it's common sense that it should be allocated perhaps to the project under which it's approved.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. We're sending agreements, not good.
Yeah, it's good. It's good.
Is that because you are promised for a pint afterwards? Is that right?
No.
We've got a contractor here saying, unfortunately, we've priced the subcontracting fee percentage at 0%. Can we agree something different with the 29? So in contract there's a part two that put a subcontracting.
I think from the employer's perspective, one of the important things to me is that as a project manager, you can only administer the contract that you've been given. Unfortunately, if that's gone into zero, and there's nothing you can do. Now, the contractor may be able to throw himself on the mercy of the employer. In terms of the project manager, he's actually, to me, it's very, you can't go off piece and do other things. You've got to stick to what the contract asks you to do. So, the actions under the contract say you are, to me, unfortunately, in that situation, I think the contract has a problem.
I would add to that and say, though, that there is nothing to stop the employer and the contractor reaching an agreement to amend the contract.
Correct.
I think, under any long-term relationship, anybody that suffers, an injustice or some form of financial harm generally doesn't benefit the project, the relationship. So I think when people get stuck on procedures and mechanisms under the NEC contract, it doesn't necessarily say this, but there's always the option to reach agreement on the resolution and move forward. The contract doesn't prescribe that, but not everything you do needs to be prescribed. I think the contract does encourage people to talk and reach agreement where possible and solve problems by mutual agreement.
And I think that, and that's the point I think that I was trying to make, that I think that is something for the contractor and employer to get from there. And I think on the 12.3 you have the opportunity to maybe have a supplemental agreement if it's because long-term contract where, as you say, I mean, ultimately you've got to look at the contract wanting to deliver an outcome, and on a cost-based contract you are trying to do that together. So again, I would take your point on board with that. I think that's a very valid point.
Your point there, Barry, it's got to be the employer.
Yes.
It's got to be the parties for 12.3. It can't be the project manager and contractor.
Yes.
So you can only act as stated, and you can propose something higher up within the echelons, but it's only the parties that can make an agreement.
Yeah. And I guess it could be that the project manager might face to the employer that it should be considered because of that there is some mutual benefit to be had out of the project. But it is between the employer to make that decision. You can only administer. And of course, if as a project manager you go off and do other things, so I did reach that agreement. Obviously, as a PM, then you could be in trouble in your own professional indemnity insurance under the employer for actually not administering the contract that you've been given.
Yeah, indeed. I think in the absence of a willingness from the employer and the contractor to reach an agreement to alter the contract, these percentages in the contract data are very, very important, and they will bite. So there's no other way around it other than by agreement in order to change it post entering into contract.
And I think a concern that I sometimes have is that, to me, maybe there's a little bit of a disconnect between maybe a way a contractor or a subcontractor is estimating the job and the way that he's actually going to recover those costs as part of defined costs. It concerns me sometimes, so I'm not really sure that people fully appreciated, the percentages, how that all works. And, obviously then you're setting off from the contracting point of view, you're setting off at risk, in not the best shape you could be because you haven't understood the schedule cost components and the percentages of sector work.
And of course, the dynamics can change according to your procurement strategy if that develops during the life of the job, or the content of the job if it's on a design and build basis, or if there's a significant amount of change that alters the dynamics of the job. Those percentages could apply in different proportions depending on how the job develops. So there is a certain amount of guesswork involved sometimes with some of that.
Yeah, and I think just picking up on that, I think, I've had situations where certainly people have come to me and say, oh, the contractor's over recovering. And, let's say to people, look, the contractor's recovering in accordance with the schedule of cost components that you've agreed. So he's not over recovering. This is a commercial deal. This is what you've agreed. If you now think that the fee percentage, the direct fee percentage, the subcontract fee percentage is too high, well, no, that's what you've agreed. So I think again, it's all about terminology and phraseology. But people are, the contract's over. No, he's recovering in accordance with the contract that you've agreed between parties. So I think that's important. I mean, this whole language thing is very important because, things soon unravel when people are running around talking about disallowed costs. And it does affect behaviours very quickly.
And all of these issues are far more acute on really large and long-term projects because, if there is a slight imbalance, the multiplies up and the balance and the numbers become quite large. In those circumstances, it may be appropriate to have a point in the job where the whole situation is reviewed. And there might be some interventions or agreements or supplement agreements into the contract to reset it onto the better footing to enable everybody to move forward together.
Absolutely. Of course, we can't forget that if we've got a direct and subcontract in contract data part 2, not only is that used for positive compensation, but also for negative as well. So it works both ways, doesn't it? If work is omitted, it's based on a forecast of cost, really those percentages. The numbers aren't dropping. That's good news. In fact, we're increasing. We've got 15 minutes left. We've got loads of questions coming through online, but I just want to address some of the questions that have been emailed through prior to the webinar. And one that I think is very pertinent is one question: are all costs incurred post-completion treated as defects and therefore disallowed? So all costs incurred post-completion treated as defects and therefore disallowed.
Right. Okay, Stuart, that's a really good question and a common occurrence. So I looked to the definition of what is a defect, and the definition points to works not in accordance with the works information. I looked to the definition of completion, and it's as stated in the works information once again. So the answer to this lies in what's in the works information, but I think there's a principle established here that not all of the works, not 100% of the work has to necessarily be complete to achieve completion. So there's a recognition that certain works will continue beyond the completion date. So I would ask
landscaping, seeding.
Yeah. So in terms of the definition of a defect, works not in accordance with the works information. Well, if the works information says that certain categories of work can carry on beyond the completion date, then they're clearly not defects. So I would say there's a distinction between items of work that have been done but have been done incorrectly, and items of work that are allowed by the works information to be completed after the completion date. And they'll be treated differently.
And I think the thing is, I always kind of think about with cost-based contracts is that if you think almost like mini businesses, if you close down a business, you won't have gathered all your costs in at the date of completion. So some people have the idea when we get to completion, that's it. Well, no, because there are still things you may well be still closing out. Maybe still closing out effectively the management of the contract in terms of compensation then for maybe the landscaping and certain other works. But I think the thing that's often missing is that we often lack clarity about what has to be achieved for completion and what is. So I think we talked earlier about this idea that actually we need to clearly state what things can be done after completion is something that needs to be in the works information very clearly, so it's clearly understood.
Yeah, the conditions of contract under the engineering and construction contract do point to the requirement to state in the works information what works are to be completed to achieve completion, or conversely, you could identify items that do not need necessarily to be completed to achieve completion. And in the absence of that, the default position is that the works are complete when the employer is able to use the works or put the asset into operation, I think, as necessary.
Yeah.
So I think it's much better, and the works information guidance published by NEC suggests that you put a clear definition. And if there are some types of work that can be completed after completion, it'd be useful to put a time frame on that, so that you could draw a line between when they, as they try to move from outstanding works into becoming a defect.
Yeah. So that's landscaping done within 6 months of completion, or to be delayed, but needs to be time bound.
It'd be a good idea too, I think. Yeah.
Okay, we've also got some other queries here that have come through online. Collaboration software. So is that part of the defined cost? Do we get reimbursed for collaboration software? I'm guessing it's things like cloud-based technology to collaborate on projects, share documents, web-based NEC portals.
I think this comes under the definition of the working areas overhead, Stuart. If I take the charge includes provision and use of equipment, supplies and services in relation to computing. So I would put it down as a service in relation to computing, therefore it should be in the working areas overhead.
I would agree with that.
Okay, we've also got a visiting director. We've got a visiting managing director or commercial director.
With a commercial director, Stuart, I'd say definitely included in defined cost.
Slight bias there?
But on a serious note, again, anybody visiting who is part of the team in the wider sense, I would argue they are involved providing the works for that day. Otherwise, I'm sure they're going to have an impact, a positive impact on the project. So I think that anybody who's in the working area is involved providing the work, even in a management capacity, could be regarded as possible.
And I think that's in the schedule of cost compliance, isn't it? Where it's not a normal place of working, but they are within the working areas, and that time is attributable to the project.
One that's just come through, which I think is quite topical, is the contractors being delayed by weather, and whether, to a certain degree, is a contractor risk. If it's above a 1 in 10 year return, and assuming the contract's not being amended, then it could be a compensation event. But the question is around if it's a contractor risk for weather, is that disallowed from the employer or not? Having shared weather.
There's a difference between something that is or is not treated as a compensation event and something that would be disallowed. So the contract allocates risk with regards to adjustment of the target on cost reimbursement contracts, but that it needs to be specifically defined as a disallowed cost for it to be disallowed.
Yeah. I think that's probably touching on the misunderstanding of what is disallowed cost. Disallowed cost is a specific definition within the contract. Yes. Okay, we've also got college fees. Now this comes up a lot. So we've got a young graduate working on a project, and we're charging college fees to the project. Is that part of the buying cost, disallowed cost?
Well, I think from an employer's perspective, I think when you look at cost component 11, you look at the idea specifically safety training is identified.
Yeah.
And again, what you sometimes find that people do go on and clarify that a little bit more, where training which is associated with the specific project would be payable. However, kind of general training probably falls within, if it's something for the business, probably fall within the fee percentage.
Yeah.
That would be a very simple view of that.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I can't see anything specific other than safety training that is listed as a defined cost under the schedule of cost component.
And I think it's a useful thing to do is actually take the schedule of cost components and you look at maybe when you look at the way that contractors calculate their cost of a person, to actually look at the components. So I think it used to be like the CITB levy for training that used to be added to the cost of people. There isn't a natural component for that within the schedule of cost component. So that would then tell you that would need them to drop into fee percentage, whereas something that isn't specifically in here, again, as we're saying, if you have the opportunity to clarify the schedule of cost requirements, some client organisations will specifically deal with training about, if it's training for a project, yes, that's payable. If it's training for the business, then that actually goes as part of the fee. Yeah. So you can take the schedule of cost requirements to the next level, but I think, as it is, it works with sensible discussion between the parties from the outset.
It does, and it's a really good topic for the commercial plan at the outset, because actually it may be in the employer's and the contractor's interest to really put a lot of training into the staff on the project to ensure that when they are procuring subcontracts, they can do well, that that they understand the contract they're trying to operate and the philosophy behind it, and all of that will benefit the project. So it seems counterproductive to disallow it if it's going to be deemed a real benefit to the project.
And I think it's also interesting that you were talking about, where you have kind of joint training sessions to talk about working practices. That obviously is a benefit to the project. That would be something that would be worth paying for from an employer's perspective, because we're going to sort out the management plan, we're going to sort out our working practices to make the project more and more smoothly and efficiently. And that certainly would be a very good investment up front. But again, if you look strictly at this, it wouldn't be in there, but that's something that could be done.
Yeah, I agree. To me, that would go back to the works information. If that was the employer's intent, I would say we want some training, we want some team building. Yeah, that would be expressed in the works information. In fact, prices it, so it's notified. But I suppose looking at the contract, it's specific to safety training, and then back to clause 2.1, it's not in defined cost, it's treated as having been a fee. So whether it's been priced in a way is academic, it's just treated as being a fee.
Yeah. I think that'd be a good point. I mean, I think this whole thing about it's some cost that's going to help the project be more efficient and effective, and I think that to me is a good thing to invest in. Yeah. That's a discussion to be had, because it's not clear where that might sit.
Absolutely. We've probably got time for one more question. It's about 7 minutes to, so probably one more question that we can have a look at is the cost of rectifying defects before completion. An employer here asking the question that they feel aggrieved that they're paying for the cost of rectifying defects prior to completion. I've heard that this should be allowed. Is that correct? Question mark.
Well, I think it is generally. The definition of disallowed cost does specifically point to correcting of defects after completion is disallowed.
Yeah.
And correcting of defects caused by the contractor not complying with a constraint on how he provides the works, taking the works information. So for me, if there's a problem with the finished product as specified, that is not disallowed. But if there's a problem with how the contractor, in other words, it's something stated in the works information that doesn't describe the finished product, the contractor has breached one of those constraints on how to, and that has specifically caused the cost to arise, then that will be disallowed. But general mistakes, setting out errors, getting things wrong first, then putting them right, you might call it efficiency, is not disallowed until after completion.
And I think the other moderation, of course, there again is it's trying to act as an incentivisation to the contractor, because he knows those costs are payable before completion, rather than not afterwards. And also, of course, we've got the moderated course of the contractor share as well coming into play on the target contract to try and balance that. Yeah. But I think there is also a question which sometimes come up. If the contracting, if you're doing a straightforward piece of work laying some concrete, the cost of correcting that defect. But what happens if the contractor maybe has several attempts to correct that defect? Should the employer pay for all of that, or is it just correcting it once? Because obviously, I think the common law is the idea that the contractor's given them opportunity to correct defects so we don't make it. But is it an endless? He just carries on doing it. Is there? So I think maybe from a legal perspective, there might be some issue about reasonableness that actually has 2 or 3 attempts, that's okay. But when we get to several attempts, we're not thinking, well, actually, we're not. Maybe we shouldn't be paying for that. But again, I think the other point here is that these clauses are all very good. My issues is for an employer side. How are you actually going to manage this? How do we know what work has been done for defects, whether it be before completion or after completion? What are we doing to manage it? So it's great having these things in place, and this is sometimes you find with the Z clauses, it's great having these clauses in there, but then there's issues about what the interpretation of that clause is, how it should be applied, and this is where you sometimes get into danger, whereas the core NEC disallowed cost provisions are really about kind of stopping abuse and misuse of defined cost and reining back, excessive use of treating it like a hospital job, too much resources on site, too many people, too much equipment, not using plant and materials efficiently. So, there's definitely an area there to be looked at.
I think it's very important for an employer to get an understanding of the competence of a contractor going into a cost reimbursable arrangement. So obvious, really, and looking at the inspection and test plans or the quality management plans of the contractor prior to getting into contract would be a good idea.
Good one. Okay, well, we've had over 600 people logging in. We've got over 60 questions. We've only answered a few of them. So what we will endeavour to do is to answer those questions directly or through the next newsletter. Thank you for joining us. Hope you found it informative and useful, if not thought-provoking. Probably debates that will continue in people's offices after the webinar. Just to kind of sum up from Matthew's experience, from a contractor's point of view, Matthew, what kind of 3 things would you say need to be in place to get the most out of option C, target cost reimbursable contracts? Key things that you would say are critical to success.
I think it's really important to have a joined-up plan and understanding of how you're going to audit and operate the costs, etc., and the application of disallowed costs. I think there is no time constraint in the contract, but it's helpful for the parties to operate a progressive closeout. I think it's, as we touched on before, if a substantial amount of cost is going to be incurred from subcontractors, then have very good audit trail of how you're paying subcontractors and agreeing compensation dates. There could be huge sums of money at stake to get that wrong, and you may not find out until the end. And another common situation would be where I think it's really helpful to have some form of time recording system on the project. So we're kind of getting to the usual topic of keeping good records here. And I think it's really important, if you've got a great deal of money being spent on individual operatives or staff, that the time recording system and the amount of hours you're paying people kind of align. If that turns out to be out of sync at the end of the job, i.e. you've been paying people way more hours than the site clock in the system says they've worked, then that could be a real problem. So I think it's really important for contractors to pay attention to that record keeping issue.
Very good points, I think. Barry, from your employer perspective?
I think it's important that we understand costs, we understand defined costs, and we understand how costs are going to be incurred on the project, and that's done jointly with the contractor at the beginning. I think also in terms of behaviours, I think it's very important that we use the right terminology and phraseology under the contract, and certainly, from an employer's perspective, I want to make sure that the employer's team is is actually administering and using the mechanisms within the contract to provide that control for the employer, that he can have the comfort that that costs aren't being abused under the contract. I think that's important to do that. And I think that the most important thing is really, again, which reinforces what Matthew said, I think it's important that we have a joint commercial management plan which sets out the understanding of how costs are going to be paid under the contract, how they're going to be recovered, clear understanding of what disallowed cost is. So I think that's the key area. And I think going back to the last area, which is from the hobby horses, which is about the money map for understanding, well, where are those costs for the employer and being focused on. And then again, that could be introduced in the commercial management plan. If a lot of the costs, 80% of the costs are subcontractors, what is the plan's proposals for managing those subcontractors? And I think ultimately, primarily, I think it's just a realisation that the cost-based contracts are shared risks, and we need to be working together to realise the benefits from those contracts.
Well, thank you, Matthew, giving the contractor's view, and Barry from the employers. There's no argument there. It's all joined up thinking, all aligned, which is what we want to hear. Thank you for logging in and taking time on Friday to hear our views on disallowed cost. Do take advantage of the NEC user group and newsletters, and there'll be more questions and answers on these going forward. So thank you.